So now let's actually add a sign in button and actually test out some of this code that we wrote specifically, like these handlers, sign in and sign out. But before we even do that, you'll probably want to open up your Firebase project and navigate to the authentication. It should be under the build section and click get started. You do have to enable each provider. So in this case, we're going to enable Google, and it's pretty easy. I don't think we'll actually have to do anything other than just click enable. And this is our project, and you'll, I guess, want to select a support email, and you can probably just choose your email. Like in my case, I'm just going to choose Grace Allen. It's a throwaway email, so don't email me there because I don't ever check it. Once it's done, this should be kind of the screen, and then we'll have some new tabs available. The users tab is going to be the most important, and you can see that so far we don't have any users. It looks like we can manually add them if we enable email password sign up, but since YouTube doesn't have that, we're not going to have that. I'm going to dismiss this. So now let's get into the code and actually create some users after we add a sign in button. So I'm going to open up the menu, and within our nav bar is where I'm going to put the sign in button, because the sign in button is always going to be in the nav bar. So I think it makes sense to kind of group them together, but you might have a different preference. I'm going to call this sign in.tsx because it is going to be a component, and it's going to have a bit of styling. I guess I'll start with the styling, and I'm going to call it sign in-module.css. This is not really a CSS course, so I'm just going to copy and paste it, but it doesn't look exactly like the YouTube button. It's pretty similar. So first, just the button itself is going to be given a sign in class. It is going to be displayed as an inline block. I think a regular block would probably be fine as well. It's going to have a 1 pixel border that's going to be gray. The color, and the color this applies to the text of the button, is going to be dark blue. It's going to have a bit of vertical and horizontal padding. It's going to be a rounded button. This is going to be the font, because I just inspected the YouTube CSS and this was the same font. And font size is going to be about this. Font weight is going to be this. And when you hover it, it should be a pointer. I'm not 100% sure if this is actually necessary or not. Maybe we'll test out if it actually is. And when you hover the button, the background color should change a bit and the border should become transparent. So that's about it. Now for the interesting part, the actual component. So this is going to teach us a bit more about React, specifically how we can pass props into a component. But the first thing I'm going to do is just create the default function. It's not called watch, it's called sign in. And we are going to return, you know what, I'm actually just going to disable Copilot. There we go. Now Copilot is finally going to shut up and we can actually just code. We're going to have a div, and that's going to kind of group everything together for us. It's going to be kind of the container of our button. And I'm actually not 100% sure that we'll need this div. We might be able to convert this into a fragment, which is kind of a React component, because what we're going to do here is have two buttons, believe it or not. We're going to have a sign in button and a sign out button. So we'll start with the sign out button and just copy and paste that for the sign in button. And both of them are going to be styled the same. So I'm going to give them both, the same class name, which we probably should import that class. We can import styles like this. Maybe this would be a good time for Copilot, but oh well. And it's going to be within the sign in module. And here, I think it was styles.signin, even though this is applied to the sign out button. I guess I could have chosen a better name there, but you know what they say, naming is hard. Oh, and by the way, the reason we're using a fragment is because we don't actually need to render an element. A div would kind of be an unnecessary element in our DOM, and I think a fragment just avoids us doing that. And we're not allowed to have multiple elements. Like if we return like this, it gives us an error. That's exactly why we're wrapping this in a fragment. Basically, we want to render this component differently based on the state of our app. If the user is signed in, we want to render the sign out button. Otherwise, we want to render the sign in button. So how do we know that? Well, we could kind of import that functionality from here. We could import Firebase, like the helper functions that we defined. And actually, we are going to do that. We're going to import some of them, like here. I'm going to import a couple functions, sign in with Google. Make sure it's the one that is imported from Firebase, because there might be some similar names. Like here, you can see there's two sign out functions, one that we created and one that's from Firebase Auth. I guess that's a reason that maybe we could have had a better name for this, but I'll kind of leave that as is. And we'll also sign out. We'll import that one as well, because for each of these buttons, we want to add a click handler. Like for sign out, of course, I'm sure you can guess. I guess it's not like that. I'm thinking of Angular, so sorry about that. But on click here, we want to execute the sign out function that we imported. And we don't actually have to like call it here. I think that's a difference from Angular, but I'll forget talking about Angular. Like this is how we would execute this function on a click event. And here it's going to be pretty similar. On click, we want to execute sign in with Google, and that's going to open up a dialog, and we'll test that out in just a second. Now we're not actually done with this component yet, but I want to show you where we're going to render it. We're going to go into the navbar component, and here we have this logo. This is the YouTube logo. And then after that, we also want the sign in button. We have to import it, but I think it should just auto import like this, and it's going to self close it. So now let's take a look at what our app looks like. I'm still running it, by the way, maybe not. Okay, this is actually a very good error, and I probably should have mentioned it earlier. The reason we're getting this error actually is because we are adding interactivity to this sign in button. And the thing about interactivity is that first of all, by default, every component in Next.js 13 is a server-side component. So, I mean, this will render fine on the server, but then if we want to add click handlers and then execute some JavaScript, that's going to execute on the client side. Like an event like this is by definition interactivity, like an on-click handler. So we have to convert this into a client-side component. And the good thing is it's very, very easy to do. All you have to do is at the top, declare a string like this, and it's not even assigned to anything. It's just use client. That's the whole thing. And now if I open up the terminal, I'm pretty sure we got rid of the error. Now I'm going to close this and I'm going to navigate to our browser, and you can see this is what we get. So our nav bar has two buttons now, sign in, sign out. I'm sure you can imagine we don't want both of these to be rendered. And the sign in button is also going to render on the watch page because it's a part of the nav bar. So you might be getting the idea. Now I could click this and sign in, but I'm actually going to wait for that because I want to kind of finish up our component before we actually test it out end to end, even though I'm pretty sure this will work as it is. Back into the code, now that we've actually rendered the sign in button, let's complete it. First of all, we're going to use our Firebase functions. We already are using sign in with Google and sign out, but remember I declared this one over here. This is going to help us know if we're already signed in or signed out. Now I could use this function within our sign in component, and that would be a perfectly valid way to do it because this is a client side component. We're allowed to execute JavaScript and then interact with it. And this is the type of thing that will actually continuously update this or execute this callback every time the auth state changes. So that would technically work, but I'll tell you right now that in the future, we're actually going to create another component as well. And that component is also going to go in the nav bar. It's going to be I was figuring out how to do comments here, but I think we can do it like this. But basically this is a to do. We're going to add a upload button here. But remember that upload button should only render if the user is already signed in. So we're kind of realizing that probably it's better to maintain that state of whether the user is signed in or not. It's better to maintain it in the parent navbar component because then we can just share that value with sign in and we can share it with the upload button. We don't have to reuse this function in multiple places. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. In this navbar component, I'm going to import the function. I already forgot what it was called, on auth state change. Yep. And it's the helper function. It's not the original function. We're going to import the helper here. And the way we're going to use it actually is going to be with two React hooks. One is going to be the use state hook. That's kind of a way for us to manage state in function components like this. Like this is a function React component. They used to use class components, but this is kind of the newer way to do things. And it might be kind of weird to you. How are we maintaining state within a function? Well, that's kind of how JavaScript works. It's called JavaScript closure. This is the keyword that you'd probably want to look up if you're kind of curious about how JavaScript does this. Basically, the state inside of a function is still maintained after the function has finished executing. It's kind of weird compared to other languages because usually you'd expect all these variables to go out of scope of memory, but that's not how JavaScript works because, you know, JavaScript is pretty weird. So we're using the use state hook here and we're going to import it from React just like this up above. And initially we're going to set the user to null because we don't know what the user is or not. I'll add a comment here, init user state. And then we're going to use another React hook called use effect. This is kind of a way to run some JavaScript just a single time when this function actually loads. You might think, well, can't we just put that JavaScript like declare right here, like before we actually execute the return? Well, it's a better practice to use useEffect because this kind of hooks into the life cycle of the component. That's why these are called hooks. They run at the appropriate time based on like the React component's life cycle. And this is going to take a callback here that's going to execute. It doesn't have any parameters, and it's going to take a second parameter as well, I believe, which is optional. So in this case, I'm actually not going to pass it in, but the second parameter would be dependencies. In this case, we don't need any. So here, what do I want to do? Well, that onState changed helper that we defined, that's what I want to ultimately call. And remember, it accepts a callback. So we're kind of having callbacks in callbacks. That's interesting. It's not going to be super complicated, thankfully. It's going to be very simple. Every time the auth state changes, just take that user, that onState changed helper is going to emit a user. Now the user could be undefined or it could be of type user. When you hover it, TypeScript will kind of tell you that. And it does that because when we defined this function, we made sure that that's what the type of the callback is. So going back, what are we going to do with that user? Well, we're just going to save it. We're just going to say set user is going to be set like this. So that's kind of how these state hooks work. These two variables, one is going to be the variable that maintains the state, and the second is going to be one that actually updates the state. And you might be wondering, why are we getting an error? Well, because the type of this is user or null. But when we initialize useState to null, it pretty much assumed implicitly, TypeScript assumed that the value, the type of user is always going to be of type null. And you can confirm that by hovering over it. TypeScript assumes that this guy is always null, but we can change that by explicitly setting the type of this generic function to be either user, which we're going to import from Firebase auth, or by being null. It's allowed to be user or null. So that's a little bit of TypeScript knowledge. There's one last thing we're going to do inside of this useEffect hook, and that is actually returning an anonymous function, which is also going to be very, very simple so that we don't even need a body for it. It's going to be like this, and we're going to call unsubscribe, but first we should probably declare that variable here, because what this was actually doing, this onState changed helper, remember, we return onState change from here, and this guy actually returns a function called unsubscribe. Of course, if we're going to subscribe to this event and we want to execute this callback, we also should have a way to unsubscribe. Like at some point, maybe we don't want to keep executing this callback forever. Like maybe this component here dies at some point and we don't want to just keep executing this code for no reason. That's similar to like a memory leak. It's not good for performance. So what we do is return this function, which will call that unsubscribe function that's returned from here. So just like this. Yep. So what this useEffect is doing is it's returning this. It's not necessarily calling it, it's returning this function. And that function is going to be executed based on, like I said, the life cycle of this component, because this useEffect hook can hook into the life cycle of it. If this component dies or for some reason is re-rendered, this function will end up executing, and that's pretty important to know. So I'll even add a comment there. Now we did all of that work. What do we want to use this user for? Well, to put it simple, we're going to pass it into this sign in component. And the way to do that is take the prop name user, which is yet to be defined. We're going to define it in a second, and pass in the user object that we have locally. The reason it's giving us an error is because this sign in component doesn't have a property named user, at least not yet. We're going to define it now. Let's go into that component, and you can define the props that it can accept just based on the function. You can tell the creators of React are definitely fans of functional programming. This is going to take an object. In our case, it's just going to have a single field, and it's going to be user. And it's good to explicitly set the type of this because right now it's implicitly any. But the value that we're passing in, of course, has a type of user or null. So I'm going to up here define an interface called sign in props, and I'm going to set it to have a single property of user. If we wanted to add more properties in the future, we could do that here. But for now, it's just going to have a single one, which is going to be either of type user or of type null. And that's what this thing is going to be here. So I'm going to set it to sign in props. And we're getting this error here because we didn't import it. So let me just type it again and then tab complete to import that guy. So now we're getting pretty close to what we want. And by the way, I could probably just change this to be called props, and then like down here, we could call props and then .user. But just to keep it simple, I'm going to have an object like this, which is called destructing, by the way. So we can kind of explicitly like extract this guy. I think it's called destructing assignment. That's a minor detail. Now, to continue, the easiest way to conditionally render one of these is to, first of all, have some curly braces here where we can actually just put some JavaScript code. That's how JSX works. And we're going to use the ternary operator. That's the easiest one. So basically, if user is defined, meaning it's not null, then we want to render some piece of code. In the other case, and we use a colon for that, that's how the ternary operator works, we want to render some other piece of code, some other piece of JSX. I'm sure you can guess which is which. When we have a user defined, then we want to render the sign out button. And when they're not defined, we want to render the sign in button, just like that. So you can add comments here if you'd like. I won't, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and I think comments would probably just make it less readable. Now let's make sure we have all our files saved, and let's take a look at what happens now, because we're pretty much done. Oh, and actually we did get another error, and this is also a really good error. You might have actually caught it as I was making it, but notice how we're using use effect and use state within this component. That's definitely interactivity. Like as the auth state changes, we're updating the state of this, and that's going to change the state of this component. So we probably want to make this guy also a client-side component, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. If we really wanted to make this a server-side component, an alternative would be to basically take this code and move it within the sign-in component. And that way the image could be server-side rendered, but I don't think that's a huge deal, so we won't be going with that. So now let's head back to our browser, and we see basically what we expect, just a single sign in button, because of course we're not signed in yet. If I navigate to the root page, same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and now try signing in. By the way, I'm really zoomed in, so this might display differently for you. Whoops. Okay, got this guy open again, but now I'm going to try logging in with my Google account, and it says that this is like our project. That makes sense. And there we go. I signed in, and you can see the sign out button changed. Let's go into our Firebase console and see, okay, nothing shows here yet, but we can go ahead and refresh this. And yep, we get some information. I'll zoom out, and you can see this is the email of the account we created. This is the provider. This is the date that they were created, the last time they were signed in. There's a user ID as well. So this is a very, very good start. But we're going to be building on this because I'm sure you can imagine we want more information than this stored for our users. We might want their profile picture and things like that. So for that, we're going to be needing Firestore. And before I end the video, I want to quickly mention, because I didn't before, when we enabled billing for our GCP project, that also upgraded this project as well. So in case you weren't aware of that, this Firebase project has also been upgraded to a billing plan. But for now, let's leave things there, and we'll talk about Firestore in the next video.